what we expect if we're going to diagnose intellectual disability is that the overall score from these tests, stemming from 7, well actually it's 4 to 10 subtests, is that the global composite, the IQ, is around 70 or lower. 2 standard deviations below the mean. Hey, we've got rid of the Stanford Binet 4, which had the standard deviation of 16, which really just screwed everything up, right? It's all standardized with a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. 70 or below. We got a little bit of wiggle room in there, right, with some consideration of the standard error of measurement, the standard deviation of the error around the observed score, or the confidence interval that stems from it that we can extend to like 95%. So it's around maybe 75 or lower. So there's some wiggle room there. That's what we're expecting for the basic identification of intellectual disability. We also examine deficits in adaptive behavior. I think this is actually harder because the measurement technology isn't quite as advanced. We know that adaptive behaviors describe effectiveness in meeting the standards of a culture, that they're age-related. So what we'd expect from a 3-year-old is very different than what we'd expect from a 10-year-old. It's defined by expectations and standards of others. In some cultures, they may not be expected to clear the table or to take care of themselves or to feed themselves. Certainly that's true in many Asian countries. The young children are fed by their parents because it ends up being in some ways a lot cleaner to do it that way than to give the kid the spoon and have them splash food everywhere. And it's defined by typical performance and not quote-unquote ability. So adaptive behaviors describe, again, typical performance and not when and independent performance as well. So we try to represent this in those with intellectual disabilities by highlighting adaptive skilled areas. This is from the DSM-4. It's going to change a little bit with the DSM-5, but you see the skill areas that should be represented. And they're fairly diverse, and some are much more advanced, like leisure and work for older individuals and young adults. The American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities has described 3 major conceptual areas that must be considered: social, practical, and conceptual. This is personified probably best in the adaptive behavior assessment system, if you're familiar with it. I'll talk about it in a moment. Or it's an overall score. So it could be a deficit in any one of those areas or a deficit in the overall score. I wanted to just say that your criteria, as I looked them up online, mirror the federal definition and the consensus definition of ID. Manifested during the developmental period, you have significant limitations in cognitive functioning. There are limitations in adaptive behavior, and it, of course, in a school-based setting, adversely affects educational performance. Here's the prescription for the assessment. Intelligence tests, adaptive behavior measures. Out of home and school, I like that. It's ecologically valid, across environments, a developmental history, etc. This is standard. Really no variation. We've done some research showing that really there's more variation across states than what you might expect. What I wanted to say here was, again, Indiana is following the standard definition and assessment practices. You do, vary the labels for intellectual disability. This is important for us. This is a central part of my presentation today. Based on IQs, Indiana and the APA say that we can label children as having these qualifiers. So they have mild intellectual disability if the IQ is 2 standard deviations below to 3 standard deviations below. So this IQ is very important here. For those with moderate, severe, and profound, it's more than 3 standard deviations below the mean. And from looking at some of your data from the state level, it's very clear that the State Department of Education differentiates between mild, moderate, and severe. We don't hear of profound much anymore. It's probably lumped in with severe. And part of the problem is, from our study of IQ test, very few go below 40. So you really can't, unless you're giving a very unique intelligence test that's non-mainstream, or maybe like an old Binet LM from pre-86. Or they're very old, maybe I should say, or they're young adults. So 40s are kind of lower end standard. But we're going to see some lessening of emphasis on the IQs to identify these levels of impairment and more emphasis on adaptive behavior. We're going to enter some of the same problems. They're not going to be able to go low enough unless they convert their standard scores to something like V-scale scores like the Vineland did to have a low enough floor. It's going to be intriguing to see how they actualize this. But mild, moderate, severe, and profound are terms you should know as it relates to intellectual disabilities. For a number of reasons. Well, this slide shows that Indiana uses the same terms, again, not profound. So really we're talking about adaptive behaviors or IQs 70 or below. And look, most of the bell curves don't go below 55. This is incredibly low prevalence stuff way down here, at least theoretically. Now, the research on individuals with intellectual disabilities would show that most children, and we could see this probabilistically looking at the bell curve, fall in the mild range. Look at that. 85% fall in that range. In epidemiological studies, across studies, etc. And the groups are composed by fewer and fewer individuals as we move from moderate to severe and profound. Obviously, composing 15% or less. So most of the kids we're going to see as school psychologists and in special education, by definition, are going to be in the mild range, with IQs between 70 and 55. Still, compared to their peers, low functioning, and this overall is low prevalence, probably no more than 2 or 3% of the school-age population. But within that group, most are in the mild category.